All right, it's 5:30. We're going to call the meeting to order. This will be a special session, excuse me. This will be to consider financing options and future direction for City Hall and public safety facilities, a presentation of financial information regarding the 1916 City Hall and public safety facilities project, and discussion of options and future direction.
With we've got the financial information, all this is going to be based upon the 16 point some million dollars. There could be other possibilities that could drive our cost down, so we'll just kind of go through this then to get a general knowledge, because I think there's some things we can discuss of options to cut our costs. I know 16 million is not something that I feel we can afford.
No,
so
people that have talked to me they've raised holy Cain when that first figure came out. So, yeah, I definitely agree. We have better.
Certainly, and that's the purpose of this meeting is, kind of where are we going, what's next, and then we can do financial modeling on an estimated cost of what those options are. But Mike will go through, kind of show how we could pay for it at 16 million or less. It's really more, not so much the amount, but the process and how we would fund.
I want to make sure that it was clear that we're not assuming we're going to go for
Yeah,
16
sure.
million at this time, but
Sure.
it's just kind of a general line graph, I guess, is what I was hoping we were seeing, because
Yeah.
I think it is something that there's, looking at the report, I think the steering committee did a excellent job in getting facts together, and it gives us a good reference on what we can do, and kind of still opens some ideas of where we can head from now.
Definitely. So I'll turn it over to Mike, and we'll go through it. It won't take a few, 10
All right,
minutes
Mike.
or so.
You'll be covering this document here?
Yes, I will, and that is part of what the presentation, that it's the basis for that.
Okay.
So keep in mind with what you brought up there, the $16 million project, that's just the basis that we formulated this. This is the information that we had as the direction at this time, at least with the steering committee's recommendation of option A. So as we look through it, and a lot of this stuff later can be incorporated right back into a different scenario if that's the direction that we're going to head.
Sure.
So yeah,
Excuse me.
the scope of this evaluation is to evaluate the funding and repayment of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the 1916 City Hall and Public Safety Facility Project. And this is going to be used to provide information for the discussion and then making decisions as we go forward. So just to give you everybody a little background, going back in history of how we got to where we are today. In 2016, the city offices at the 1916 City Hall building were abandoned due to mold concerns and multiple complaints of illness and workman's comp claims. City offices were temporarily relocated to the Mercy building, where we exist today. In 2017, the City Commission formed a citizen steering committee to help guide the direction of finding permanent City Hall locations and what that was going to look like. The Commission also brought on Trainer HL to help facilitate that committee and steering them through those different options and reaching a consensus. During this point in time, to have a full understanding of what the city's needs, Trainer also did a space allocation study to understand what those needs were. In total, 6 options were placed before the committee. And through that, the options were eliminated, and ultimately they arrived at a consensus and presented to the commission option A as their recommendation. The option A recommendation does come with a cost, and that, again, this is what this, the report is based on, of a little over $16 million. Move to the next one. Here is a little rendering here of what that option A would look like. Go back there, David, just one slide there. So everybody can see there. Yeah, you're fine there. No, no, go forward. All right.
Yes, no, yes, no.
Yes, no, yes, no. And then on the next one, the next slide, that does show what that space allocation study came up with. All right, moving on to the next one, David. Phase 1 was put together by the commission and approved in 2018, and that was to do some sealing the envelope of the existing 1916 City Hall building to prevent any further deterioration. That included putting a new roof on, replacing windows, doing some exterior tuck pointing of the building, as well as some selective interior demolition from non-historic walls in the structure. Phase 1 went out to bid on January 7th, and bids are due on February 7th this year. So on the next slide, nope, back one, David. There you go. On the $15 million, this is what a $15 million 20-year obligation estimated bond repayment schedule would be, and we used $15 million on this, knowing that part of the $16 million included putting a new roof on and replacing the windows. And so the things that are contained in phase 1, and by spending $1.3 million, we know that that ultimate cost can come off there and wouldn't need to be financed, because phase 1 is being paid with available cash and the special use sales tax. All right, David. The primary resources of repayment and issuing bonds is through ad valorem tax and sales tax. Currently, the city has 3% sales tax. Citywide is 9.5% overall, with 6.5% going to the state, 3% staying in the community. They're broken down in 1% segments as indicated above: general fund, special use sales tax, and an education sales tax. The general fund sales tax, that one will remain in place until it is repealed. The special use sales tax, that sunsets in 2022, October of 2022. The education 1% sales tax, half of that expires in April of 2032, or excuse me, 2031, and the other half expires in October of 2032. Okay, David. So as we look at an option for funding using ad valorem taxes or property taxes, just to give you an idea of what our approved mill rate was for 2019, it was 54.422, and an overall assessed valuation of close to 48 million, just underneath that. And for the purposes of the evaluation and some of the areas that the analysis was occurred, we're going to assume, although not likely, that that assessed valuation would remain static throughout the course of the 20-year evaluation period. Okay, next. So looking at that, we know the 54.422 is in place to support current city operations. So if a ad valorem tax scenario was used to repay that debt, the $50 million debt, this is what the additional mills would be required to support that debt repayment. Now, these are just the mill rates, but to give you just kind of an example of what kind of impact that would have to your property taxes you pay. If you had a $100,000 home, These additions in 2023 would be an increase of $137.95. Assuming the value stayed constant over that 20-year period, that amount would rise to $350.88 in 2042. Next, we'll look at the sales tax, and very specifically the 1% special use sales tax. The tax allocations within this fund are broken down in 4 areas. It's general fund support. That goes back to the general fund to help minimize the impacts of the city's use of property taxes. There's 1/4% for buildings and facilities, another for streets and sidewalks, and then the final one is for ADA improvements. Next. So the sales tax, looking back over the last 10 years, it's remained relatively static. There's been some minor ups and downs. 2014 was a good year. That just shows what the economic development impact can be on our sales tax. That was the year that we had the pipeline in, and it brought some additional revenues to the city. But overall, it is static, and there's no economic factors in the area that we're aware of that would indicate that would change over time as we look into the future. So the $1.931 million that we've used for the last couple of years in our budgeting purposes will remain part of that and constant throughout the evaluation. Okay. Next thing, we want to take a look at existing demands on our special use sales tax, because that's important as we think if we're going to use special use sales tax to pay for a bond obligation. There are a couple of areas that they are obligated currently and need to remain in place. So any bond payment would be over and above what those are. And that's the 25% of the special use sales tax going back to the general fund support, which brings in about $482,000 a year to the general fund. And that equates to about a 10 mil savings in property taxes. And the other portion are 3 bond issues, 2012, 2013, 2015. Those bond payments were targeted to be paid for with the special use sales tax. And those run through 2030. Okay, this is just a chart that kind of shows you what that looks like. Keep in mind, the total generation of the special use sales tax is just a little over $1.9 million. So there is other areas as it exists today for where we utilize it for other infrastructure purposes. Okay. The other issue that we have to take in consideration is other community priorities. 2018, the Commission formed the Strategic Planning Advisory Committee. That committee was tasked with finding directives and initiatives for a community-based strategic plan. They have developed these 5 key initiatives and brought it back to the Commission, and this plan was approved by the Commission in 2018. Obviously, one of the big areas is infrastructure. We've had a lot of deferred maintenance in the infrastructure area, whether it's ADA, streets, our facilities, water lines, sewer lines. So the water and sewer lines, they are their own enterprise fund. They have fee revenue that offsets their need to be able to complete their infrastructure needs. And we have, in 2017, raise that fee schedule to help accommodate tackling those issues. But the other area, streets, ADA, and the facilities, they need another funding source, and that primary funding source has come from the 1% special use sales tax. The city staff has begun initial development of a 20-year plan as part of the strategic plan, and we've kind of laid out preliminary estimates here. And as you look at the 20-year planned cost, it's $22 million. And broken down, taking out some other resources that can be deployed to minimize that, we're looking at $822,000 a year need in these areas that will need to be funded. And as I spoke of that, some of the other resource areas that we can pull from, we can't deplete these, but they are sources should we need to tap into them. There's the Economic Development Transportation Fund. We have the Project Reserve Fund, which is the 5 mills. We also have existing special use sales tax cash balances existing that can also be put into play. And there is some excess funding and some completed projects, and some of that funding could be made available to address this. Go ahead.
Mike, what is the balance in the existing special use sales tax?
So
what's the cash balance in
through
that?
our projections today, because we already have 2019 kind of laid out,
Okay.
and looking into how we were going to come up with the $1.3 million for phase one, I'm showing that we should have a beginning balance in 2020 of $930,000.
And on the Economic Development Transportation Fund, what's the balance in
The
that?
balance on that, and of course, I'm looking at all of this beginning in 2020. As I recall, it's somewhere close to $500,000 today. When we look at that, there's additional sources that come in from franchise fees, very specifically annually. We do have several things that we do pay out of there, but there are excess funds available on an annual basis that could be used along with what that cash balance is today.
So both of these totals, the Economic Development Transportation Fund and the sales tax, special use sales tax, those amounts will continue to fluctuate.
Sure,
we
absolutely. And
continue to
you're
go on.
going
Sure.
to build some. I know for the economic development, we looked at using some of the available cash plus about $50,000 a year out of that over that 20-year period. The project reserve, I believe, was $100,000 out of that fund to go towards infrastructure. And of course, the special use sales tax, it was driven for those other three key infrastructure needs.
Okay. On that Project Reserve Fund, that $5 million, that's the one that we're used to making payments on the new
Fire truck.
fire apparatus.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then the other purpose for that particular, to draw money from that particular fund was for street projects.
Yes, absolutely. Infrastructure. You bet.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, Dave. Yep. So, taking a look at this, incorporating a City Hall Phase 2 bond payment that we discussed earlier, and laying that in top of our existing obligations within the special use sales tax. This gives you kind of a picture of where it goes over time. David, if you could kind of show that white area, no, back up, that white area there in between the gray. The gray represents the new bond issue. So all that area in the white underneath the red line is available resources during those periods that could be used for infrastructure, which is small in comparison to what our actual needs are. The red line, that is our sales tax revenues for that fund. And you can get a little better look at that on the next slide, David. What that looks like when you lay the infrastructure needs from our initial plan into place. There's a lot of funding that would not happen as it exists today with just the 1% sales tax, special use sales tax. But there is a scenario that we can look at that would take care of the scenario and the fundings for infrastructure, our existing obligations, as well as the new bond issue. And that would be repurposing and extending the education sales tax funds at the end of their time in 2031 and 2032. We would be short for a period of time there, but it does give us the ability and the vehicle by which to get these things funded. So the big thing would be from 2023 to 2030, we're going to have to use some of the other available resources, cash balances, and then also deferring a few of those projects back up into beyond 2030 to fit in that. Questions there? Okay. Just other considerations that need to be discussed as we look towards the future and finding this permanent home for City Hall. We have the Mercy building. Once we're no longer in there, well, where are we going with it? Currently, we have existing tenants in there. We have St. John's that's in there on a 5-year lease with 3 years remaining. We also have DCF in there. They're on an annual lease, but it looks like they may be extending that for a period of time. What's the marketing sale of the building? Where are we going on that? What's the expectations of the revenues that can be derived from that sale? And as another alternative that was originally discussed, what's the cost of demoing the building and moving on? And finally, the future direction of where we're going from here, and these are critical conversations for the city and for the residents as we understand these. The decisions that are going to be made are important. That's going to shape the future and impact our community for decades. So looking at that, where we need the direction, and I think we all need the direction, and part of the conversation is where are we going with City Hall? What are the plans, project costs? What are our timelines of moving forward with it? There's bond issues in play here, so taking it to a public vote to get the public behind us on that, to issue those bonds, as well as any public votes necessary to extend the special use sales tax and education sales tax and repurposing those. And then again, additionally, just the plans for the Mercy building. The Mercy building should happen to be sold before phase 2 is complete and we're relocated. We do have to figure out a solution for a temporary place for City Hall to be located. And then we also have issues of the apparatus bay that exist over there at the temporary City Hall. And looking at that and just understanding the timeline of where the commission is looking at going on that. So with that said, I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Okay. This is all contingent on getting the public to continuation of the special use sales tax, which sunsets in 2022.
That is right.
So we can draw on that particular source of funding to fund some of these projects. So that'll be something that will need to go for a vote before the public to approve that, so that will continue on.
That and the education sales tax. I think when we look at everything and really understand what those infrastructure needs, if we're going to be serious about taking care of our infrastructure and discontinue our practice of deferring those things that we've done for decades, this is the time to get on top of it. Granted, those funds won't be available for over another 10 years, but that'll come into play within that time frame. So that we can plan and develop that plan around that. And then just in general, the special use sales tax, as I mentioned, we have obligations that run out to 2030. The special use sales tax it sunsets in 2022. So we have needs there that go beyond that 2022 period into the future.
Getting back on the money that's set aside for phase 1, I think that was identified, going from memory here, a few meetings ago, approximately $880,000.
So there's
so that
$880,000 that was set aside
Right.
in 2018.
Right.
Okay. So then that leaves us about another $410,000, which we actually have the cash resources today. So we've got cash reserves of $1.3 million in the special use sales tax funds today. to cover
And
the cost of phase one.
as far as phase one, we'll just be able to draw down those funds to cover the cost for phase one, right?
That's correct.
Okay. My other question, I just lost it. Okay, maybe it'll come back to me later.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm here all night.
Okay. Hopefully, we're not here all night.
Well, that's true too.
And I think you have one citizen.
Yes, yes.
Any
I
other
do.
questions? Gary, Leonard?
No, thank you.
No.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you, Mike. Okay, I do have a request to address the city commission. Dean Hayes, would you please step forward?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening. Dean Hayes, 2625 Rolling Green Drive. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Earlier this month, I spoke to you in favor of this meeting, and I'm glad we are here this evening to talk about this issue. When I did speak to you, I raised a number of questions regarding the City Hall building project, and I will not repeat all of those again. But I do wish to emphasize the issue of operating costs one more time. Operating costs of each of the scenarios is what I'm talking about that you're considering. Operating costs, maintenance and upkeep, insurance costs are all part of the question of what's it going to cost for the new structure and new situation. These costs are largely determined by the size and type of the structure that you're talking about, and many of those costs are designed in at the time that the building is determined, the architectural plans of the building are determined. So do we understand what those costs will be for this new City Hall situation, and how do they compare to what we consider to be our current operating costs, which would be Building D? If we choose to borrow money, this is a different subject, the additional cost of interest payments should also be considered in the total cost of the building. In the example provided this evening, a $15 million bond would result in about $8 million worth of interest over the life of the bond. Ideally, the final City Hall solution would result in a lower total cost than any of the other alternatives you would consider, and that would include the cost of interest. So do we understand the cost of the debt for the upcoming phases? How many years of operating cost savings would we have to, will it take to pay off the bonds and the interest that we're talking about financing? Knowing the answers to these questions should help assure that we have made a prudent choice regarding City Hall, a choice that aligns with the needs and the plans for the future of Independence. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to add that I didn't prepare a statement about. But one of the things that occurred to me while Mike was making his presentation, and I don't know whether the slides are numbered in the same way that the presentation that is out here, but if you return to Table 9, where we have a 1% special use sales tax spending with the Phase 2 bond payment and infrastructure capital, this shows no change in the 1% special use sales tax spending. One of the things that occurred to me is that below the red line, if the gray portion that's associated with the new project and the bond associated with the new project were reduced by each of the years that the yellow line is above, or the yellow area is above the red line, what value or what total financing would that represent, the gray area, if it were adjusted to bring all of the yellow infrastructure cost below the red line? It would appear that would probably cut it by about 2/3, but I'm not sure what that is. It would be worthy of running that scenario, I believe, so that you could say what is the maximum amount of project financing that would fit in under the red line. That's all I have for you at this time, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
Would you like a copy of this?
Yes, please. Oh, Mike, I remembered it finally came to me. It's just a comment on the 1.2 or $1.3 million on that phase one.
Yes,
I understood there were approximately $200,000 worth of historical tax credits that would come on the backside of that.
somewhere in there, and I think maybe Vance, we do have Vance Kelly with Trainer here tonight, and he may be able to answer that a little bit better. From what I've understood out of the scenario, the tax credit piece actually would not come into play until the phase two portion of that. Vance, is that a fair assessment?
You can actually claim your credit per project as long as you exceed the minimum cost of $5,000 per year. So the way that we have talked with the commission in the past is that phase one could be complete, paperwork could be submitted, and you could be issued the tax credit.
Okay.
The question then is, when do you sell that tax credit? Because when you have a larger tax credit, the opportunity to receive a higher return is better. So you may want, like Mike was saying, you may want to wait until after phase two is
Okay.
complete.
Yeah, we looked back in 2017 at a scenario on some tax credits and the larger dollar amounts when you're selling those. A lot of the larger banks are in the market to purchase those. The larger the amount, the closer to 90% on the dollar that you can get.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Vance, thank you. Mike, thank you. Sorry, I'm writing as fast as I can. Okay. Gentlemen? Gary?
Where to start?
Go.
You know, you weren't a commissioner when we decided to move forward with the steering committee,
Right.
but it was the kind of thing where the three of us felt like this was too big a decision for us to make, you know, at a twice-a-month meeting. So let's form this steering group. We picked 5 people each. We put 15 members on the board. And we were initially looking, I think, at 5 options. And the three of us agreed. I mean, I know you're not included, but the 3
Right.
commissioners at the time said, let's do, if the committee comes up with a recommendation, let's agree to do it. So the part that concerns me, I mean, we were looking at like 5 options. We had 15 people. I thought we'd probably never get a majority. I mean, I really didn't see us ever getting more than 4 or 5 in favor of any one of the plans. But then the group came back and said, we have a consensus. Everybody's in favor of this plan. So to me, it seemed like, okay, well, this is a no-brainer. This is why we did it. This committee spent time. They really dug into it. This is the recommendation. However, it doesn't feel that way at all now because you were on the committee.
Right.
And you don't seem to want to spend $16,000. Dean has told me he has no interest in spending $16 million.
Yes.
So where is the disconnect? If the committee all agreed this was the best plan, and now they're all telling me this is a terrible plan, I'm just lost as to how this came about. I'd love either of you to address that, if you would.
Let me give you some background on this. I served on the steering committee, and that question continually came up about the excessive cost. The problem with the steering committee, our input was there wasn't a dollar amount set as to how big this project was going to be. So we didn't have any say as to what the dollar amount was going to be.
So this was the
We
best
didn't have-
choice if money was no object, or if
Exactly.
they were all the same cost.
We didn't
or-
have any say as to what the actual square footage of that was going to be. This was all driven by city administration, city staff. So we were given a list of options, and the way it was presented to me, we all agreed that not one person would hold up the process, that we would all eventually vote and come up with something that we were either in favor of, or we really weren't that crazy about,
But you can live with.
or you could live with, or you bit your tongue and you realized that you were in the minority, and one person wasn't going to hold up the process.
Okay.
So the options that we had, we really didn't have good choices because it was so open-ended when it was presented to the commissioners. And as a matter of fact, I went back through some notes, and I think I've brought it up a couple of times. Option B, when it came down to it, option A and option B were considered. And I was looking at option B, and if I think that's one where we were going to add a facility onto the existing apparatus bay as it exists out on the Mercy Hospital facility grounds. That particular fund, when I went back and checked, because we're getting all these figures thrown at us, they're changing, the square footage is changing, the dollar amount's changing, we're looking at all these options. I've actually determined that option B actually, the estimated cost, that's not actually right. If I've determined it right, that should be about $2+ million less. So instead of $14,878,043, that should have been somewhere around 12 billion plus. So when you look at 16.1 and 12, let's just for throwing a dollar amount out, let's say that's 12,878. So if you would have looked at that, compared option A and option B, then there's a pretty good gap between 16,125,000 and 12,878. But that's after the fact. I didn't come up with that until I went back and looked at my notes, and I determined that when they were looking at square footage, he looked at an addition. In the narrative, he showed adding on to the existing apparatus bay of, I'm going by memory, which somewhere in the vicinity of over 18,000 plus square feet. But when he determined the actual cost of the project, he determined a new facility of 28,878 feet, or whatever it turned out to be. So
I did email Andy Pitts that specific question after that meeting.
Right.
And actually sent him, I believe I sent him the link so he could listen to what you said. And he says his numbers are accurate. He said there was not an error.
No, his area is off.
Okay, but
Yeah.
I did email him and he
Okay.
did tell me that, and he also made a comment that materials were up because of the, I don't know, some tariffs or something. But anyway, I did ask him that question, and he felt the numbers were correct. So.
okay.
Well,
When I read the narrative and looked at the numbers, I saw a disconnect there. So that's what led me to look a little further into it. So I'm sorry.
It is 10,000 square feet too large, because he said the addition, the new construction will be 28,286 square feet, and he listed the addition as 18,000 square feet, but when he figured the total area for construction, he had the full 28,000.
Well,
But-
I appreciate the explanation. I'm still surprised it worked out that way. When I first heard the results, I was very surprised we had a consensus at that figure.
Right.
Because that's a staggering sum with all our needs. But what you're saying is you guys didn't all really agree. Let's spend $16 million on this plan.
No, there were.
Is that fair,
there
Dean?
were-
Am I saying that fairly? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but.
One of the things that the steering committee did is it defined the rules of consensus very early on. And while I've taught consensus building myself in the past to the Leadership Independence class, one of the things about this particular consensus process is that the results were not or the agreement at the end was fairly broad. It was fairly loose, that you didn't, we weren't really looking for 100% buy-in from each of the people on the steering committee.
Sure.
In fact, it's like Lewis described, there were several levels of buy-in, and if you fell into either one of those
Right.
three levels of buy-in, it was considered to be a
An A vote.
favorable vote.
Yeah, okay.
And the other point about the steering committee is that it's not unusual when you set out in search of a project like this, that some kind of project cap is defined in advance so that you know what's too much, so that you can stay within the bounds of reason. And that was not defined for the steering committee. We looked at all of these options without the understanding of what would be too much. So really we were looking at we were really focused more on the attributes of the options and not their cost when we
Right.
were comparing one to the other.
Yeah.
The other thing is that there was a fairly limited list of options considered, because there are literally probably thousands of ways you could have
Sure.
approached the project,
Right.
but these were the ones that the steering committee considered.
But I see that right off the bat, I mean, early on, a couple were eliminated. One of them, which is the cheapest by a huge margin, is to remodel the Mercy building and just remain there. Is that still a bad plan? I mean, is that?
Well, what I can tell you, when we, it's part of the steering committee, when we looked at it, we looked at the operating, maintenance and operating expenses for the facility.
Right, which are very high.
Which are very high. Matter of fact, from March of 2016, when we took over billing for the facility, up through and including 2019, and I'm just giving you a dollar amount of operations and maintenance expenses that are in the budget. For 2019, that dollar amount is $432,000. As of the end of 2019, we will have spent $1,676,655 for maintenance and operation expenses at the Mercy facility. That does not include taking $319,000 out of the sanitation fund to build a, quote, temporary apparatus bay, nor does that figure in because that was not a turnkey building. So there were other costs associated with that. So if you look at what we've invested in that property so far, that at the best that I can determine, you're looking at somewhere over $2 million. So you look at $432,000 budgeted per year. You look at what that's going to cost over a 10-year period. You're looking at $4,300,000. Yes. Yes.
Going further on that
Sure.
cost. Of course, if we rehabilitated the building at $4 million, it would become much more efficient than it is now. So I don't think you could carry those costs forward. Just in lighting alone, if we went to, LEDs and everything, would save a lot. But we would certainly, at least that's the way I look at it, if you redid Mercy, you would redo, we made a proposal
Right.
several months ago to
Especially
actually
in
reduce
HVAC.
those costs, and we decided not to do that. So we're still spending, that for those air exchangers, a high cost. But
Sure.
that would change. So don't project that same cost is what I'm
Sure.
saying. It should be reduced. to
Sure.
that-
Well, on the cost savings, it said 25%. It was no formula, no data to do it. The engineer in his letter said, I think. And I thinking from an engineer that told me we could put a hot water, chilled water system in the library for 50,000 and it bid in at 100,000.
Sure.
Thinking,
Sure.
I want to see data.
Yeah, I'm not going to, there were projections by experts, and I've been through things like that. I think I mentioned, In the last community, we did some analysis similar on electrical savings by purchasing the streetlight system. It wasn't, the data was, all right, you may have a lower rate here and there, but we didn't know what our maintenance costs. We had to project those things. Yeah, you have to make an educated guess. But you're right. I think there were like 3 different analyses that looked at it. What I'm saying is sometimes you have to project and get a good estimated cost. But I just want to make sure that going forward, if that option to stay there, we would certainly redo for energy savings.
What I see, what the steering committee did without setting a limit to start with, they analyzed the problem with no restraints. They looked at all the data. They had real numbers to consider to make their decision. And that's where we got the 16 million. I think the data that they've got into the report is usable. The thing is, we have to deal with the bottom line that, you look at the charts, we can't afford that. But what can we do? You've either cut square footage and you cut dollar costs. I think there's some combinations in the two that, look, we're getting prepared for phase 2 without any bond, without any borrowed money. So we're going to do that with cash in hand. Look how much money we're saving there. You look at the interior renovation, you look at the square footage cost projected for option A or option B, without the tax credit, it was a little over $300 a square foot, $296 for option B, but interior renovation costs of the 1916 building won't be nearly that. 100, 150 would be a good range to go upper quality, I think. You're looking at your mechanical systems will be much simpler than a boiler chiller, because that's one thing that hadn't been factored in. The hot water, chilled water system is all the control valves. They're expensive. They're expensive to deal with. They're expensive to replace. They're troublesome. And, the costs associated with that. So part of what Dean was saying is looking at long-term costs. We've got to get simpler systems. The same, with the options we have now, combining option B, do we do an addition to that? Do we look at the square footage? At one time, there was a design to house everything in existing city hall. Where do we increase? Remember, we had that plan that everything was there. We were adding on one apparatus bay and everything was there. I'm thinking, well, if we take fire EMS out, then what does that space become? We're looking at trends with technology are downsizing. We require less space for storage. We require less people to do the same job. So is there ways to house administration and police in 1910 building where we add on an apparatus onto the apparatus bay, living quarters and offices for fire EMS? I think what we've got is to work from. We've just got to look at how to get our money. 'Cause when you look at the expense graphs of financing, we're stretching our town to the limit in those, and we can't. If we look at the advantage of adding on to the apparatus bay, a pre-engineered building. We don't have to do masonry construction. We can make nice quarters there, energy efficient too. So, I think we've got something to work from. It's just now, how do we fit within those parameters? We're looking at total, what was it, 64,000 square feet in Building D. You know, we're not a developer. We're not in a rental business of space. It's way more than what we need. So let's get the building to somebody that is in development. Let them handle the leasing space. Let's not consume our time with that. Let's get into square footage that we need and not overbuild that as time changes and we need less square footage, that we're not dealing with space we don't need. And what are we going to do? So,
Make a couple of comments, and I agree with what you're saying. I looked at, even before I accepted the job here, I was looking through the documents and saw that space allocation study, and that was completed, and they showed the table there. Total needed square footage, and again, they did a needs analysis. And what do you need? Like you said, they started off with not a dollar cap, but what do you need? Mm-hmm. And it came out 46,000, almost 47,000 square feet. Current City Hall is just under 20,000 square feet. So that was, I guess, drove the whole second building. And so that's my concern, as well as a question, is where do you put that space need? But secondly, of course, we're moving, it's out to bid now for phase one. Does that mean once we award the bid for phase one that we're committed? I mean, I kind of get the sense that if we do that, we're committed to that building, not building D or any other of the options. We're committed to building D, or the 1916 historic, however it's then reconfigured or added onto, or so forth. That's because we award the bid, but I think we're at the point of no return on that option.
Well, that was the direction of the steering committee, and a lot of that was driven by the fact that at that time there was a realtor that was dealing with a brokerage firm, that there was entity that was interested in the facility, Building D, the temporary city hall. They were looking at the possibility of establishing a mental health facility there. They were looking at initially needing 14,000 square, I'm going by memory, 14,000 square feet. They would, if they needed to provide additional services that were identified in the city, they would provide those. They were going to, if that transpired, they were going to create 25 jobs at an average $45,000 per year. If there wasn't any tax abatement given on the facility, it would generate $205,000 and change as far as tax revenue for the county, and the city would get a share of that. You'd also be collecting wastewater billing at the facility there, and that would be jobs that would be a different type of job for the community, and that would lead to some supporting businesses being able to prop that facility up. So that was kind of factored into that. And then the other factor was that I did mention in 2015, looking at the dollars amount budgeted for the 1916 City Hall, I believe we spent $109,242. I might be off on the $242, but it was 109 plus. But I'm assuming probably by that time we probably weren't spending much money on maintenance. I would imagine we were probably looking to vacate the building as quickly as possible. So just by that, what we spent in 2015 as to what we projected for 2019, you're looking at almost 4 times the cost. So all those factors came into play when we took a look at that. And that's kind of led the steering committee to move in that direction. Once all that information came out, there wasn't anybody that, I mean, they were ready to move the building down the road. I mean, and where we go from there, that's pretty much, there wasn't a lot of support for that after all that information came out, and rightfully so. I mean, I hear from people all the time. They're begging me, please, whatever you guys decide to do not raise our property taxes anymore. Do not do that. I looked at the latest population figures for 2017. Our population is 8,729. We've lost 1,135 people over the last several years, and that trend has continued downward. Our poverty level here in this city is 20.58% of people that live under the poverty level. So we're dealing with a lot of issues here, not only how we're going to pay for this, who's going to pay for it, how we're going to pay for it, what it is we can actually afford. Because for some people, they're going to say, I just can't afford to be here anymore. The costs of living here exceed what I'm bringing in, and they have no choice. And I hear from people on a monthly basis. And if I could sell my house, I'd leave in a minute. So, I mean, it's such a complex problem. And, it's going to take a collective group. We all put our heads together and find a way that we can be responsible, meet the needs of what what our facilities need to be. And it needs to be something that the public's going to be able to buy in. I served on that first school bond issue, and it was somewhere between $6 and $7 million. I went around and raised from businesses money for advertising and promote that, and it didn't pass. And then it went to $22.1 million, and I got out at that point. Then it went to $45.2 million. And, there's people still today that are debating whether that was a wise decision to bond out that amount of money for that length of time. Because what it did, it tied our hands as what was available that we could draw on to meet other needs. And we're tied to that till 2031 and 2032. So all these factors play into it. And, I'm not real happy that all this has come to a head as far as infrastructure needs, not only city facilities, but our streets. All these factors come in, and yeah, we're going to have to find a way to deal with it. We're different than anybody else that's preceded us, because we are going to, and we will find a way to do this. I don't know how, but we will. This is no longer putting this off and passing it down and let somebody else worry about it. That road is gone. It's closed. We're not going back there. So it's going to be a collective problem that we're going to have to solve, because I don't want to put our employees back in a facility that's run down and has issues, but I also have an obligation to the people that have elected us, that we also need to be responsible. So there's going to be some give and take here, and my guess is not everybody's going to be completely happy, but that's life.
Yeah.
That's life. Sometimes
the art of compromise, right?
It's a hard compromise. You get a little and you take a little, and I think that's where we're at, what we're faced with.
Just a couple of comments to follow up on that. First, that's why we structured the presentation as not touching property tax. Hopefully we could fund even the $15 million using special use sales tax, assuming we restructured, repurposed our 1% and the school district's 1%, in order to also not necessarily just fund this project, but also to leave some funds for our other infrastructure needs. That's that balance we got to find. You know, we can't totally wipe out the special use sales tax for this one project. We still need streets improvements, and while we have some other sources, we still need special use sales tax for that, of course, as well as the 0.25% that comes back to the general fund that Mike talked about. So there is that balance, but that's why we try to structure without touching property tax, because we agree with that process. And secondly, sometimes you have to realize what you're going to get for that money as well. School district, like you mentioned there, 46 million or whatever it was. What did they get for that? They got, well, I surely like the middle school. It's a landmark for the city of Independence, and I'm not advocating, you know, the best of all worlds, but you've got a 100-year-old plus building there that to me is a landmark for the city of Independence, certainly the seat of local government, and so I hope we don't take kind of a, well, let's just kind of fix it up a little bit and try to put everybody back in there. That's why I was looking at that space study. It's like, wow, how are we going to get that, you know, we've got the current apparatus bay, which I guess was intended to be moved and not used in the, you know, because we'd be building a new fire station, police station. I don't, you know, you talked about options there, but as I think you mentioned, that money came from the sanitation fund, which hopefully would come back, but that's where it was purposed for. We took money that was originally budgeted for one item, a capital item, and restructured, and that's what would happen here if we did. I mean, even, you know, a much lesser amount, you're still going to have to put that squeeze on, you know, the pie's only so big, and you put squeeze one way, it's going to reduce something else. And so that's why we tried to reach that balance. I think Mike, when he looked at that, we talked about between 800 and a million a year for our other infrastructure needs. And how could we put that into the mix there, and as you see in the graph there. So. But it's, you know, when I came here, I was excited about this project. You know, I've lived through 2 city hall projects like this, total rehabilitation. It can be done right or it can be done wrong. But you have that balance between, as you're saying, it's a delicate balance, and how much can you afford. So hopefully, again, we don't see touching the property tax to do that. I mean, that's a way to do it, and some communities do that. I don't know if Coffeyville raised property taxes when they did their city hall or what, but it's different for each community. So we have to find that balance. But that's what we need, is the direction is kind of like, so we can start planning that financial, if we're going to take option A or B or whatever, because the last, I think we talked about it, was the next step was kind of an RFQ for an architect firm to get on board to design the rehabilitation of City Hall and or fire station,
Right.
whatever that might be. But
When I talked to Cindy Price, the city clerk, over at Coffeyville here, it's been way over a year ago. It's before I was even on the commission. And they had set a cap of $5.4 million. And she indicated to me that they had spent over 2 years looking at the plans for the building. They kept making changes. They'd go back and kept trying to meet that cost parameter that was set. And I think when it was all said and done, I think they ended up spending $5.2 million. And if you haven't been to it,
yeah, it's
you
a
get
nice
some
building.
time off. It is a very nice building. It has police and fire there. It has drive-through, I believe four drive-through bays. It's a very nice facility. It has nice living quarters for the fire personnel there. It's very well designed, and I think they did that as a hard bid project, and I think Linda knows more about. I've got some information on a hard bid project, and how to understand it that I haven't had a chance to go through and read, but that's just some insight that I'm providing, how another city approached it and how they came up with the design. They were able to stay within the parameters that were set, and the end result was it's a nice project. The people that are in it love it, and it met the needs of the community. And it's on 11th Street. It's in the vicinity of where Taco Mayo is. It was an abandoned school there. Don't remember the name of the school, but it was a city block, and the school had long been demolished, and they built the facility on that. And I got to go to the open house, so that was pretty cool. So
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the Coffeyville. In fact, I think Trainer actually addressed the comparison between what they did there and what they proposed here. I mean, there are some significant differences. You can't, it's not exact apples to apples,
Right.
but I understand there's some issues with their
Square
fire
foot,
department. But,
square foot price is just an assumption.
yeah,
It varies. It
Sure.
doesn't mean nothing because it depends on how you finish the space, what type
Yeah.
of finishes, and
Exactly.
all that. So
Sure.
looking at pure square foot cost is good from where we are, but we're at the end of going into commitment. And when we authorized phase one, I understood that we were going to go with interior office renovation. There's no question of rejecting the bids. That we sent it out for bid, we're going to accept the bids as long as it's within budget. And the next phase then is looking at interior renovation and the methods to handle that, you know, whether cost control interior open office space or we go to private offices. You know, cost is going to be the determining factor, but, you know, still, I think from what I see, we would have phase one, and while construction's going on, is start looking at the interior layouts and what space is available that we can get it in there. And if, you know, still if we had everything functioning with fire and EMS and we remove that, then what can we fit in there so that we cut our new construction down to minimum? Because the interior finished space is going to be the cheapest, where we got the structure. 'Cause we're going to have to heat and cool the space, so we're not going to increase HVAC systems. It can all operate in there and use the division, then determine how much new construction we need. Then we would know the direction for phase two. And obvious that we won't be moving fire and EMS back to the building, but utilize that space for offices. And then look at some other options too, to reduce space if we have a crunch, you know. We talked about looking at upgrading the shops. Department heads could be at the shop with their crews. Be easier to handle work orders, easier to handle the projects, scheduling, overseeing the work, you know. We got the mobile unit that works good at the street department. You know, we could increase the size of that for office space. You know, there's some options there to cut our initial cost and the type of construction to keep it down. But, you know, where we're at, the question about awarding a bid is not a question. I mean, you don't understand, when you release the plans to a contractor, they expect a fair shot at getting the work
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
and having it considered, not to, I'm gonna give you a bid and then you don't really, you're just wanting to see roughly what, I mean, it'd destroy our bidding possibilities from here on out to do that to contractors. So, you know, I think it's, without a doubt, if it's in budget and we can afford it and there's not problems with that, then we've got to award the bid. We award the bid, we need to go to the interior remodeling. The question is, what goes there? You know, one thing about sending out an RFP, that's good, but where we are now with Trainer, working with, on the steering committee, working with phase one, they've got a knowledge that we're gonna have to go back and rebuild with another firm. They're gonna have to get familiar with the space, they're gonna have to get familiar with the program. You know, the work that Andy did with the steering committee, I think it was excellent, his relationship with the committee, with the townspeople, the communication, the dialogue, that they could come together with a recommendation like they did. That showed good technique there. And from now, from Vance and Ian, the work that they've done with phase one, you know, reviewing the drawings, the cost estimates, the numbers that they're showing is real accurate. You know, I would be more to go ahead and try and negotiate with Trainer for phase two, so we're not going backwards, but we can go forwards at a better rate of time, save time, that we, you know, can look at options of how do we get into phase two. If we still own the building, building D, then we really don't have to move out all at once. If we've got tenants, we've got to keep it maintained, and that's an all or nothing mechanical system. So, you know, we're not rushed to get all of phase two done at once. It gives us time to put the building on the market, and with tenants in, it's more sellable than an empty building. It gives them the potential to come in with tenants and bring more tenants and work with our existing tenants, because with the state, I think they've got an RFP out for new office space. A developer can come in and work with the state of Kansas to remodel it to fit their needs, and it gives their incentive to take the building, and it can relieve us from that responsibility. Also, with the mental health company that was looking at purchasing the building, they were willing to lease to give us a chance to relocate. So, you know, there's some options that isn't forcing us to jump and leave, but it gives us some options. And we take the sale of the building and put it back into our project.
Sure. Got just a couple of comments, especially when talking about an RFQ, and that was the last direction we got, actually, was to seek that. And I think, having been through projects like this, it can be advantageous to actually do an RFQ, get that competition factor, and certainly there are advantages to, like you say, Leonard, of continuing with the architect that's done that, but there are also advantages of, say, bringing that competition. Plus, there are architectural firms out there that think they should get a shot at the pie here, a shot at the project to do that. But that's your decision how you want to proceed with that, with an RFQ or just negotiating with Trainer.
Well, we've done it, you know, with civil engineering, we never send out RFPs. We have one civil engineer we use on every project.
Kind of our
And
ongoing
I know there's a
consultant.
lot of civils that would like to come in and do our work.
I
too.
don't disagree that every maybe 3 years or so that you put out an RFP for. I've always been an advocate for that as well. So I agree with that. So all I'm saying is I've had architectural firms contact me as well. They'd like to see an RFQ that they could. And obviously, with an RFQ, Trainer would certainly, I think, would have an advantage on how they would propose an RFQ, having done all the preliminary work that they've done, including design of phase 1. So they would have that advantage. But again, you can go either way. That's up to the commission how they want to proceed with that. I mean, we've got some draft RFQs that we could go with fairly quickly, but that is a process, like you say. It's put it out, 30 days, review, select, versus negotiating however long that would take for phase 2. But that aside, the critical thing is that phase 2, and what do we want them to design? Whatever architectural firm we get, what do we want them to design? Do we want them to take the building as a shell and redesign the whole thing, interior, to lay out the space as needed? Take just a limited approach, the very limited demolition, and you kind of take what you have there, kind of rearrange things. I'm not an advocate of that necessarily, because I think you can really get some efficiency in the building when you can do a whole new floor plan as well. And of course, we got the fire bays there that would be used for obviously something else, council chambers, or that's for an example. Do you want to have council chambers in there where you have a fixed council chambers with the dais and so forth, versus continuing here, for example? But that's just, what's the scope of the design?
I think that's what we have to revisit the program, because those spaces, to me, that council room costs too much to use twice a month or a special meeting. This works good. It's here, and with this location, if we have a meeting and a topic that we need more space, we move across the hall. It's not like we're going to meet at City Hall, but now we've got to do a public announcement to change locations. This is ideal that we can use it not only for commission meetings, planning and zoning, but anybody wants to rent the space, and particularly I think we had a school board meeting joint with the commission, and then on some things about the hospital closing and all, that we were able to just go to the other side of the wall and conduct meeting, that we didn't have to send out a special notice. We didn't have to worry about people going to the wrong place. And I think to utilize space, I know Ian has done a good job identifying historic walls, but I mean, historic is good, but if it's going to cost us money and we're not going to be able to lose the space, a jackhammer and a sledgehammer opens that up real quick. And we can get a lot better use.
Even a historic jackhammer.
Yeah.
I agree.
But, so when we look at space, I think it's utilization to our best advantage inside. We've tried to identify to give us some flexibility on the interior renovation, particularly around the main entrance, but boy, you get past that main entrance and I think I could even sacrifice some of the walls there to open up and get better flow if we're going to get better utilization of the space. So I think it's one, we have to look at the program to get square footage within something reason, and looking at staffing and just what will work. bring it down. And, you know, again, with the idea, if everything fit in there once, and we take out fire EMS, then we should even have extra space.
Should be pretty roomy, you would think.
Yeah.
Well, that's what the question I have when I go back and see that, the study, space allocation study, police, they show taking up 12,000 some square feet, and the building's only 19,000, and
Yeah.
so where do you, still seems like there's not.
Well, what I've had
For a
on
police.
design projects, particularly with houses, is people tell me what they want, but then when they lay it out and find out that what it's going to cost, and now it's like, well, you know, I really don't need a 15 by 20 bedroom.
Right.
They start scaling it back down into reason. I think we've set what we really wanted, but now let's see what we really need. And I did one project that I didn't think we could fit the space in, but that's all we had. We couldn't add it on in some way. You know, you start manipulating the spaces that you get it to function. And one of the advantages of open office design is you don't lose the square footage from your walls. It's amazing how much square footage is consumed in a building with wall thickness. So, you know, I think it's one that we need to reevaluate our square footage in our office spaces and start saying, here's what we've got, and we're going to make it work in there, and go from there. One thing is, and sometimes outsourcing can save us space, rental space, some offices. You know, there's a lot of options that we can consider too, but you know, I still think that if we had a workable plan that we were presented and it all fit in there, that we can't make it work if we do separate fire EMS from that building. And like I said, look at the department heads being with the remodeling that was discussed at the shops. Put the department heads there and work with that. That's going to free up additional space, but
And the cost to that, of course. I mean, that's part of the cost.
yeah. Yeah, we were already budgeting remodeling on some of the shops anyway, so,
A little bit.
yeah. And, you know, it needs to be functional.
I'm going to really depend on you and you as we navigate this process. You spend a lifetime designing buildings. You're well equipped to handle any ADA questions and concerns. You've worked with design. You've worked the whole scope of this, and you've also been in places where you've been involved in buildings and that. So I know what my limitations are. So I'm going to depend heavily on you two gentlemen. And we're going to figure out a way with city staff, the city manager, how we're going to do this. The end result is it has to be something that will meet our needs, but more importantly, it's going to have to be palatable to the citizens, because they're the ones that are going to decide thumbs up or thumbs down. So we've got a work cut out for us, but there will be, you know, there will be give and take. I mean, that's just the reality of it is. If we had unlimited resources, that would be a lot different. We don't. The reality of everything hits home, and that's what we got to face. But we've got to move forward on this. We can't.
It's, speaking of moving forward, that, as you may recall in our strategic plan, one of the things that came up was City Hall, make a selection and go forward. You know, let's move forward. So to me, that, like I say, we are, as Leonard pointed out, we're committed to 1916. It's not if, and we're out there, we're going to award a bid for the phase 1. So what phase 2's next? So that's the decision I see next is how do you want to proceed with an architectural firm to do the phase 2? Do you want to negotiate with Trainer, or do you want to put it on our RFQ out and get that going?
Yeah, I personally would like to just negotiate first with Trainer. You know, as being an architect, going into interview, I know that a firm like them would have an advantage. And I always hated to be just as a sounding board to see if we're really going to get a good deal, because, you know, it costs time and money to come for an interview. You know, I think the things that I've seen wouldn't be found any better in another firm. Their detail, the thoroughness, that's usually the separation of a firm, is how well they document the work and the specifications, and that's one of the things I always prided myself in, being a detailer. And from what I saw that Ian put together was a well-detailed set of plans, and we'll know how many change orders we have. That's where we get our costs, and we'll find out in phase 1. But from what I saw and the type of work there, it is thorough. So, you know, I wouldn't be opposed. I would probably like to see the opportunity to negotiate with them for phase 1, what kind of fee they would be able to provide us with, and scope of work, and sit down and talk to them direct.
Gary, what's your thinking on that?
On the same question?
Yeah.
You know, that's a tough one for me. When we first started this process, our goal was to find somebody that would be really good at facilitating this process we were going to go through,
Right.
This working group. And some of the people we interviewed, as I remember, weren't even architectural firms. They were groups that do facilitation. So my goal at the time was to choose a facilitator for the process, and I thought they were a good choice. I'm not as pleased with their results, because I've heard from 2 of their members that went through it that, like, well, really, we didn't really agree to this. You know, this is what they say we agreed to, but we really didn't agree. So I'm not as big a fan as Leonard is. I didn't really choose them for their architectural abilities. I chose them as a good facilitator. I'm not sure they did a great job facilitating it, based on what I've heard you say and what Dean said. That, you know, so what I heard from them is option A is what everybody wants, and now I'm hearing, well, nobody on the committee really likes option A. It's too expensive. So it feels to me like there's a disconnect.
I think what I took away from it, and when people complained to me about the dollar amount, I said, what you should take away from this is that we felt like, steering committee felt like the 1916 building, that it was structurally sound, that it had value, that it was an anchor of the downtown. And they felt like we should build a public safety facility of some sorts that would accommodate the fire, EMS, and they were looking at that time putting police all together in a facility. But with fire and EMS out of the 1916 facility, that gives us a relook at configuring the square footage there to where it's a very good possibility we can accommodate the police and the administration with some tweaks here and there in the building, and it's not necessary that they all need to be together. When I had a chance to go to Arc City on some training and visit with their city manager, their fire, and they do a combination, fire and EMS. They're in an abandoned armory, which is directly east of downtown Independence. The police are in the city administration building downtown. So that armory is big enough to hold all the vehicles of the fire and EMS. They've got all the equipment in there they got. So even places that I've been, they're not necessarily all
Sure.
combined in one building, and that's
Right.
not necessary anymore to do that. And this building is east of Independence. It's probably, taking a guess, probably a half a mile,
East of
maybe
Arc-
6 or 7
East
blocks.
of Arc City?
Yeah, well, it's east of the downtown area.
Okay, you said east of Independence, so I wanted to make sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, thank you. No, so even that, and I've got to be the facilities, and that's another story, but.
But so basically, what I hear you saying now is, you like the general thought of option A. Everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people say that City Hall, the original City Hall is worth saving. So let's save it. We've already agreed to do that. We've already
Yep.
started that process.
Yep.
And then we'll come up with another building for our public safety, and we'll just find a way to do it for a heck of a lot less than the number they put together. Is that a fair statement? More like what Coffeyville spent?
Yeah, because when it came down to it, option A and B were pretty close.
Yeah, really close, I know.
They were really close. So in the end, and I'm not trying to take up for Trainer, but this was the for lack of a better word, package that they were given. There weren't any constraints as to what this project was going to be. So there were no constraints on that end.
Sure.
And then there wasn't constraints as to how big this building was going to be. So they worked within the constraints of what was dictated to them by.
Yeah,
So, they did what they were supposed to do with what they had to work with, so.
fair enough.
I mean, if we had made constraints on that and given them some parameters to work within, we might have had a different outcome, but it was pretty much left wide open, and this is the end result of what we got by that.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying.
Sure.
I just, again, to interview other architectural firms, to me, it sounds like they're looking at much grander facilities than we have in mind. If we're saying, let's do it for $5 million, and they're saying it's gonna be $16 million, are we sure this is the firm we wanna work with?
Well, I don't think they said it was gonna be 16 million. They brought that to us. We brought them the facility and they gave us a number. I think the only reason they located that building across the street is because they were given the information it should be close to City Hall. That
Okay.
was the committee's decision based upon the information they had. The thing that they gave us that other facilitators didn't give us was the ability to give us accurate numbers that designers and engineers before hadn't given us. Every number we had had before was off. And they were able to not only facilitate the committee to bring information together, they brought us accurate numbers to do the evaluation.
Wait, when you say accurate numbers, are you talking the dollar amounts?
Yeah, and operating costs. From some of the plans we had similar, the numbers were quite different. Operating expenses and
Okay.
things like
So you're
that.
not talking about the budget cost for the new building?
Now, I think the
Okay.
budget cost was derived just from the solutions. And it gave us that first step we had to take. And it's not saying, okay, here are A, B, and C, you pick one and you go with it. He gave us, and the steering committee gave us the options that they assembled, but it's still the commission's responsibility to evaluate that and know what we can do and bring it in to where it's palatable for all of us, you know. One thing, final decision is always the responsibility of the commission. We should never assign a committee or a council with them responsible to make that final decision. That's not right. It comes to us. The steering committee did an excellent job working and assimilating the facts. They came, and here's their recommendations looking at what we need. But they don't know all the numbers. They don't know the valuations, the other number figures, the other expenses that we have. but they brought us something to use, and now we have to say, this is great, but what can we do? And how can we get it down that it's going to give us more room to operate? And that's eliminating the amount of new construction. That's the easiest way to get the cost down, eliminate the amount of new construction. Utilize what we've got for the most so that, and that's where looking at, you know, the temporary apparatus building, you know, when you look at temporary, it's only as if you're going to sell it and find somebody to buy, and you're not going to get it for what it's worth.
Sure.
Because if you look at trying to take it down and move it, you're going to spend as much money to do that, if not more, than just leave it there and give it away and go build new. So then, with that in mind, it's like, how can I take advantage of what we've already spent money in, 300,000 to 400,000 total probably. To I know it's like 317, but we had other expenses, and recoup that cost. And that would be to add on, but then add on as little square footage as we need. Then that is offset by what we can do there. So, you know, I think the steering committee did what they were tasked to do. Now it's our responsibility to take that information and make it a workable plan with all our other obligations. And, you know, that retraining, we're going to have to pay any other firm to get educated on it that trainer already has with the program, the building, and all this. So it's going to cost more to go to another architect. And you know, there are good architects out there. I think we found a good one in Trainer from what they've done, and we're not going to lose anything by going on with them other than time and maybe a little more money for another firm.
Can I make my pitch now for, I agree with a lot of that discussion. Obviously, yeah, we have to make it work for us. Sometimes you can't compare what this city did this or that city did that. It's what we need in Independence and what we can afford without. But my pitch is, again, you know, work environment for employees is extremely important. Studies continue to show that the work environment can be a motivator or can be a demotivator depending on provide. It shows for a lot of reasons. And you should be consistent with your values when you're looking at work environment for employees. And our values, one of them, is, of course, is excellence. Now, again, that doesn't mean we have gold-plated things in City Hall, but again, you want a nice work environment for employees. It doesn't necessarily, well, it helps motivate them, but it removes those demotivators. And obviously, we had some in the old City Hall. And again, so we have to have that balance, but again, we want to have a nice work environment. It improves productivity if you have the right design for employees and they feel valued and you get their hearts and minds committed to the organization. So that's just my statement generally on work environment, because looking at it in the past, in my experience, it is important. So we can't not take that into consideration when
Well,
we.
I don't see how they would have a bad work environment being in Building D. In fact, you know, if you go back with the high ceilings, you have a much more pleasant work environment with the volume than you have with a 8 or 9 foot ceiling. You know, I don't see any way that we would remodel 1916 City Hall and not have a nice work environment, particularly if you go with open office planning. You've got that whole volume. You're not sitting in a 10 by 10 office. You've got that space, and you've got the volume. You've got the large windows, and
I totally agree with you on the main floor. On the basement, I'm not as confident, because that square footage is counting the basement. As I remember, it was kind of less than wonderful.
Well, it's not gonna be, it'll be remodeled.
I know,
It
but
won't
still,
be-
you're still
It's
in
still
a
in the
basement. It's
basement.
still, you know, there are no windows.
Yeah, there's windows in the basement.
Are there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there,
Sorry, I didn't
there's
remember that.
windows, natural light. You know,
Little windows on the, yeah.
you can remodel a basement just as nice as the first floor or second floor. Yeah,
I
I
don't know
don't
if
see
that
the
would- I mean,
basement as
we-
being a hindrance.
Not to get into the design right now, I mean, that's what we hire an architect firm to help
Yeah.
us work through these things here, but I'm assuming dispatch, as it's presently constituted, you know, we do both sheriff, we house at least sheriff and police. Now, I don't know if that would continue, what the space would allow, in that building, but that, again, that's.
Well, that's something
that's
else
a
that could be worked
future
out with
Design.
maybe combining into a one dispatch instead of multiple dispatch centers in the
Yeah.
county too.
Yeah.
That's an option. You know, if it's gonna save all of us money, that would be something to consider too.
Sure, if it saves money.
Yeah, that's the best.
Haven't, yeah, we always want to do that.
Yeah,
I had a question on, the lease revenue currently is about 180,000 a year. Did that come off, when you figured the operating costs, did you deduct the lease revenue from that, or was that just the cost?
No, I didn't, because, you know, the leases that are structured, you know, that they can be renewed on a yearly basis, and they can be broken and moved out, so that's not gonna necessarily be a given dollar amount you can count on for the next 20 years, because things change, and that space may become available and become empty again, and now you can't count on that as a revenue source every year, because that's subject to change. That's subject to change due to the businesses that are renting the space. The bottom line with Trainer, because we all had concerns about dollar amounts, was that his saying was, you know, you can always go back and you can always massage the costs down, and you can also look at the square footage, and you can determine another way of how do you want to utilize it. He always made that statement because he knew we had concerns about that. But he was just working with the parameters that he was given, and that's what he had to work with. That's what we had to deal with. So where do we go from here? Because I know where we have to go, I'm just not sure
well,
how we're going to get there. What's our next step, gentlemen?
the one step was with phase one, it's out to bid. We're going to get bids. We're going to award a contract depending on available funds in the bid. The next step would be, before we even look at financing, is determine for phase two, how do we get there? We need to select an architect. And, you know, do we hire a trainer to take that capacity and go on, or not? You know, then after we hire the architect, we work with the architect to evaluate the square footage of what will go in the 1916 building, and what goes to a possible addition to the temporary apparatus bay that becomes a permanent fire EMS facility. You know, I think, you know, my desire would be to continue with Trainer to get it going, and in that time, work that they would develop concepts for the 1916 building, and in that, I'm sure we're going to have more than a plan. There'll be some modeling that we can see the concepts of space development too, to assure that, you know, the work environment is not going to be an issue. That, you know, there's so much potential with the volumes when you move out into the apparatus bays with that, the flexibility, those overhead doors, the sally port with the police. I mean, there's a lot of potential there. And so I think that's what we have to go ahead and award the contract, get that going, and the next step is an architect. And then look at preliminary, because the most important part of this project is going to be the preliminary design. We have to look at space utilization and modify our program, and then go on from there. You know, we don't want to rush the preliminary design. It's got to be well thought out and effective, that we can start looking at the cost control there too. Because we don't want to blow our budget on finishes or whatever, but so I think basically that's what I see our plan would be. And you know, the question is, do we want to negotiate with Trainer initially and see what the possibility is there? Not just give him the contract or give them the contract, but sit down and negotiate with them. And that would be at a special, either in a commission meeting or a special meeting.
Well, I'm glad you said, when you said negotiate with Trainer about the scope of work, that you weren't meaning that we would award the contractor Trainer, but, so you've clarified that statement for me. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely negotiate in case, you know, it gives us the open end if we're not satisfied with what they're offering us.
Right.
We're not, you know, I wouldn't want to immediately award a contract, but I think we need to talk and visit with them and help define scope, because, you know, right now with nothing in writing, I don't even know what I'm talking scope-wise, you know, how far is it going to go, which way?
Yeah.
But we need to sit down and get it in writing, so when we both leave, we'll know exactly what they're going to provide us with, full service. One of the things you mentioned that Coffeyville did was design build, and they used that to control their cost. And, you know, that's some of the things that we need to visit with an architect. Do we want to look at design build or not? You know, I've got mixed emotions with design build, you know, where you kind of lose some control. You don't have your own paid eyes watching out for you and that. But I think those are all the things a part of negotiating with the designer should be brought out, of how we look and how they feel on going forward. But
For the people that'll be watching this later, could you give a simple definition of what you just talked about?
Design build is when the designer and the contractor are partnered together, that it allows you the input of a design professional to work with the contractor to control the final cost. So instead of the designer designing and making decisions of materials and all, and then the contractor bidding it, working together, that they work and formulate the cheapest means and methods from initial start. So they become the team that builds it. What they are working together, and we had one contract, but then what it eliminates is our representative making sure that we're getting what we're paid for.
Yeah.
That everything, you know, there's ways to shorten the cost of the project, that you pay for a heavy-duty quality hardware and you get residential quality. That, you know, there are a lot of ways that happens, and that's what you lose on design build.
Design build, I'm familiar, in fact, one of the projects we did at City Hall was a design build. It worked very well. There's a lot of advantage to that. I'd support the design build concept if you choose the right team.
That's critical. Very critical.
Get that team together.
Yeah.
They work well together.
Yeah. Because there's some time savings and cost savings.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that what that Burns and McDonald originally ordered it to them, and weren't they trying to do it that way?
You know, I don't remember.
Or when you were picking a facilitator, and I thought you guys awarded it to them first?
Yeah,
And wasn't that what they were proposing?
I can't remember on it.
Somewhere else.
Don't remember that either.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, may I say
Yes.
just a few more words?
Yes, go ahead, Dean.
As one of these steps going forward, then, that you were talking about steps in going forward, one of the steps going forward, I would hope you would continue to consider that the final result of your analysis should be some kind of cost comparison. Understanding that the costs of Building D and moving to Building D and operating in Building D have been what they have been, that is, in this type of calculation, considered to be something like, called sunk cost, which really is not part of a future state consideration. You really need to consider what the ongoing costs of any of these options you consider would be from right now or from some kind of project start date forward, because those costs that have already been spent cannot be recuperated.
Right.
So you cannot recoup those costs, so they are really not part of a future decision process. So please, if you would, incorporate into your planning of how to go forward to consider the lowest future costs and the lowest total cost of the project, including operating costs, as I had enumerated earlier. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dean. Got it?
I guess my question now is, if we're moving forward and negotiating with Trainer, are we then negotiating a design build and negotiating for that? And so it'd be Trainer plus whomever. I mean, is that what would be moving in terms of the next step and selecting
I
or
think the-
negotiating with Trainer?
We need to schedule a meeting with Trainer to
Talk
discuss
about that.
the options. Usually, if you go design build, then that's their selection of the contractor.
Right.
It's got to be somebody
They
that
team
they
up with.
want, and that's where, you know, we have to evaluate
Right.
that, because then it, you know, it's going to take all the money out of Montgomery County and the region for construction, other than maybe minute materials,
Uh-huh.
because the main cost of the contractor is going to be outside the area, and that's an economic impact that we have, and we have to consider all that too. So I think, you know, the next thing I see for us is to schedule a meeting with Trainer and sit down and
Yeah, we could, I mean, as
Discuss
staff,
options.
we could start that process and meeting with them and talking about the scope, and then we'd schedule a meeting, and then they'd come back with a proposal saying, we're teaming up with this construction firm, and go from there.
Yeah, 'cause I think
Accept that or not,
I think they should do a presentation, you know, to the commission
right,
with how they see the project going, and both as architect and design build for this. You know, when you look at an interior project, design build becomes less relevant, because the contractor is going to hire a metal stud drywall company. They're going to hire HVAC, electric, plumber. They're going to hire out painting. So a lot of times the general will use some of his own crew, but very little will be in-house. So the actual savings on an interior remodeling as far as design build is less, where Coffeyville, they were looking at different schemes and set their dollar amount.
Right.
They had to go back and rework design and construction techniques. So that's where you lose some in doing that, because you end up with some of your fire ratings, you end up with more wood construction than metal construction and studs. But on the interior, where we got a non-combustible frame, the interior is should remain metal stud and as much as non-combustible as possible. But it'd be good to let them explain the benefits. But on small interior, the advantages of design build are going to be less
Minimal.
advantageous than on a ground up new construction.
So, I guess, unless you have,
I'd like to make a motion that we schedule a presentation from Trainer concerning proceeding with phase 2.
do I have a second?
Go ahead.
Second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
Nay.
Okay, motion carries. So basically, to summarize, we'll get the bids on February the 7th for phase 1. We've identified a funding source, money we already had
Right,
set
that's
aside.
funded.
And that's gonna be awarded out, and we'll move on through phase 1, and our next concern is, what is phase 2 gonna look like? Okay?
And I'd like to do that as soon as we can.
Yeah, I would too. The sooner the better.
Get that set up, yeah. We'll talk with Vance
Get it
and
moving.
Ian and get that set up.
Okay. Okay, gentlemen, anything else?
No.
Okay, then that's the end of this meeting. Do I hear a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Do I have a second? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you for all being in attendance tonight.